Welcome to Shut Up and Sit. I'm Yedda Stansel, a consciousness coach and consultant. I'm on a mission to bring mindfulness to the modern world. Each week, we will offer ancient healing practices, real-world examples, and the latest research in neurobiology and behavior change into fun conversation that invites you to wake up your highest self. Now, let's go shut up and sit. All right, welcome back to the Shut Up and Sit podcast, everyone. Yedda here with you as usual, and I'm here today with another one of my favorite people in the world, a very special guest and client and dear friend of mine, Karrie Southall. And she's going to be talking with us today a little bit about the Shut Up and Sit movement, about the Shut Up and Sit work that she and I do together, and a little bit about emotions, which is where we're headed into. If you've been listening to the show so far, you've been learning a little bit about thoughts. We've been in chapter 2 for quite a few episodes, really getting into the nitty-gritty of thinking and thinking about thinking, which Karrie knows I love to talk about. And now we're moving into past the thought process and into the feeling process, into the emotion process. And so, Karrie, you're in the book. You're in chapter 3 with your client testimony, which we call Voices of Mindfulness. And you had a lot of really great stuff to say, not only in the book, but you're also on the website in one of our testimonial videos, which you guys, by the way, she hasn't even watched yet. And so for my lady listeners out there, we know what that feels like, right? I mean, some of us go running to be like, girl, what did I look like? What was I wearing? How was my hair? Karrie is so self-assured. She was like, I got it. I don't need to see it yet. I'm sure it was great. And, but I will tell you, since you haven't watched any of it, it is great. And I'm just really honored to have you here today to just impart a little bit of your wisdom and your story and your journey with the listeners. So welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Yedda. Super excited to be here today.
I know. I can tell. I can just tell by your energy. You're just like, yes, this is awesome. We're in the middle of a work day hanging out at a bar. Does your boss know about this? Does Pete know that you're here?
No.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, Pete, don't listen to the show. So, and the mindfulness bar, which is really cool, is actually literally across the street from your corporate office. And so we have our space, as you guys know, we film down at the mindfulness bar. So you might hear motorcycles going by today. They were on the last show. You might see all kinds of crazy stuff happening. We're here, we're real, we're live. Karrie came in and she goes, do you edit the show? And I was like, nope, we don't do that. We're just going for it. So, but we don't need to edit it because you're such a great presenter. I've seen you present and speak before. You're an incredible leader. And I'd love for the listeners to learn a little bit about Karrie. So who's Karrie? What's going on inside of your inner landscape?
Oh, well, sure. I could go on for days. Exactly. I'll summarize it as briefly as I can. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I was born into a family where I was one of 2 biological kids and had 6 adopted brothers and sisters. So
wow.
Grew up in a very unconventional family, but man, it really shaped who I am today and wouldn't change it for the world. I've been in finance for 20 plus years, chief operating officer at an asset management firm and a board member. I'm a mother of 2 teenagers, married. And we could probably do an entire podcast on being a mother of 2 teenagers.
Well, I was going to say that's a whole, actually as I was listening to you, I was like, holy cow, there are so many other episodes in there. I mean, to grow up in an unconventional family with 6 adopted siblings. But your parents did a lot of caretaking. They took care of lots of kids.
They did. They were foster parents to 40 plus children before adopting 6. So we had almost like a revolving door in our house of children coming in and out, which was, as a child, very, you had a constant playmate every day. Somebody new coming in. So
Wow. So there's an episode there. So we'll come back and revisit that one. And that's what makes you unique, but also, what you just talked about being in finance for over 20 years as a female, that's not a norm. It's becoming more of a social norm. That's a whole other episode. And definitely we're going to touch on that today to talk about women in leadership, especially in the industry that you're in. And of course, and then being a mom. Of course, I'm a mom. I got a heart for my kids. And whether you're a parent or not, mom or dad or somebody small is in your life, what I'm just loving, there's a theme kind of woven through all of what you were just saying, though. I mean, you grew up surrounded with a lot of love, a lot of success, and a lot of adversity and challenges in the sense of there was a lot of things to handle and maneuver, even from when you were small in your home growing up. Would you agree with that?
100%. But it helps me deal with change. Like I embrace change because of that. Change was constant in my life and it still is. I mean, people who don't do well with change, I think struggle. And so being able to adapt and deal with change, especially, in a time during the pandemic, and being able to pivot and go where you need to go based on what's going on in the environment.
Yeah. So speaking of change, that's kind of how you and I got connected. So you've got this career, and kind of just, we could start there with the listeners. So what was going on with your career when you and I met? Where were you? What was happening? And tell maybe a little bit about how you and I came together and started doing this work.
Sure. So I was struggling with some things at work, and went and chatted with my boss, the CEO of the organization.
The one that doesn't know that we're on the show today, people. So Pete, if you're listening, hang up now.
And he had just met you at a conference, I believe, or you guys were both attending something, and you had connected. And he was like, I have got this wonderful woman that I think you need to meet and talk to. We met at Can and had breakfast and coffee that morning, or a week later. And I remember just instantly connecting with you and clicking. And I was like, man,
people
this
say
woman,
that about me all the time.
This
Karrie.
woman gets
They're
me.
like, I just get Yedda. As me as soon. No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, this woman totally gets me. She understands me. But I have to say, when we started working together, Yedda, I was like, is leadership coaching supposed to be this hard? Like, really, just tell me the answers to the questions that I have, and help me and solve the problems that I have at work. And you just took in my opinion, an unconventional route of doing it. Looking back on it, I was like, this work is really hard. And I don't know that everybody that does leadership coaching has to work this hard. But now 4 years plus into it, I realized like what you were doing, how you were setting me up for success, and what I needed to do in order to be successful at this leadership program.
Yeah. And so, I'm curious, when we think about leadership for you, just without getting into the specifics, but really, what struggles were you having at the time when you were thinking about your own leadership development? When Pete, who again is not watching the show, came in and said, hey, I'd love for you to meet Yedda.
Well, I think one of the things is that my mind was so busy with so much going on, and the amount of responsibility that I had, that I wasn't present in conversations. I wasn't present in my job. I wasn't present as a mom. And so I was constantly anxious about the next thing that was going to come up, the next issue that was going to come up, whether it be at home or at work. And really the introspective work that I did with you, along with practicing mindfulness on a regular basis, allowed me to really kind of calm my mind and be able to be present in the moment in conversations with people, and really deeply understand and appreciate where people were coming from in whatever struggles that they were encountering.
Yeah. And, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things which it kind of is unfair, and you guys on Karrie's defense, she thought she was coming into leadership development, which is what I called it. I still call it leadership development, because to me, really, when we get into leadership development, it is personal development. So to me, I speak about them synonymously, but I think sometimes people think leadership development, and like you said, there's this old kind of stereotypical belief system that's like, oh, you want to become a better leader, you talk to somebody, they tell you how to become a better leader, and then you go just do what you need to do to become a better leader, which, hey, it's worked for some people. However, where we're moving in the world, and of course this was pre-pandemic, but the world was already moving in a really integrative capacity. And as you know, my history and the listeners have heard, integrative development has always been what I was doing, whether it was integrative medicine, whether it was integrative in behavior, but looking at the parts and pieces and having a background and expertise in human behavior, and going, you're scratching my head and going, wait a minute. If we look at behaviors, when we talk about changing behaviors in health and well-being, why wouldn't we look at behavior change when we look at leadership development? It never really made any sense to me. And so this integrative development piece, for our listeners, this is kind of a new terminology. It's been in the works for years, but the theory, David Drake, who actually developed it, was also the doctor, I guess PhD for you guys listening, who created the theory that narrative coaching was built on. So integrative development is kind of under the hood, as you know, Karrie, and then of narrative coaching and narrative release. And so what's interesting, what I would say now, if you came to me today and said, hey, Yedda, I'd like to work with you, because at the time we didn't really have the language. The theory was being developed, all these things were coming about. So David Drake, who was really instrumental in organizational development, which you know this in the corporate world, we call that OD. He was really instrumental in founding that kind of theory. He has kind of evolved that now into what's called integrative development. And I kind of bring my hands together to say that integrative, meaning actually what integrative development is a combination of OD, organizational development, and personal development. So there's an ability to go into corporate now and say, we're bringing behavioral change, but we're not bringing it in the sense of nutrition, personal training, how we think of behavior change in our personal life. It's kind of moving now into a corporate world with language that corporate people can get, because we've kind of been siloed off. So now if you came to me and we had coffee and breakfast, I'd be like, hey, cool. So let me tell you about how behaviors work, but how to bring that into a corporate setting. And so you've kind of worked through this theory as it's developed in the past couple of years. And you're right. I mean, unfortunately, it's hard work. And when I say it's hard work, and when you say it's hard work, it takes time and energy and effort. And as we were working together and all this work that I was teaching you that has now kind of come into a formal book, which I always had as kind of my own model. So integrative development allows coaches to say, what have I been trained in? Where are the parts and pieces that I'm able to work with clients? And then where's the client? What parts and pieces of expertise and strengths do they bring to the table? And so it's a model and framework, which is a little bit trippy dippy in the sense that it means there's a framework, but my framework and the pieces I put together are unique to me, which then allows me to let the client bring their parts and pieces, which are unique to them. And then we work together, not for me to tell you what to do, but in my ways of my tools coming together, putting together tools that actually help you to figure out what you know you need to do. So it's a real wisdom, I would think, kind of philosophy. So that's what you learned to do. You did the work. You rolled your sleeves up. And so what was it like going through that work and tapping into the power that is inside of you and knowing your own wisdom? What was that like in the beginning? Was it easy? Did you just jump right in and go, oh, cool, there's Karrie's wisdom. I got it.
Hell no. I wish I could say I did. It definitely... you definitely pushed me outside of my comfort zone, and definitely made me think about things that I was like, no, it's got to be easier than this. Like, again, just give me a book that I can read on executive coaching and how to be a better leader. But again, you made me really kind of do some introspective work on myself and understanding myself more and what my belief system is and where my values are and how that drives my decisions and how that drives my actions and purpose.
Yeah. So when you're in that conversation now and you've done that, the work, because you have literally done everything that's in the book. We just didn't have the book when I started with you. But when you went through this whole process and you learned thinking, feeling, behaving, you learned how your belief systems are created, what they are, which ones, are serving you or not, all the great stuff that we've gone through in the book. When you did that and you started to show up and lead not just yourself, but other people, your team at work, what started to happen for you?
Well, I really started seeing how what you taught me, I could teach other people how to do it as well. So you talked about like not giving people the answers to questions that they were or issues that they were running up against. Instead, it was much more, your favorite thing is ask questions, be curious, right? So it made me do that with folks. Instead of wanting to fix it immediately and give them an answer or give them 3 different suggestions on how to fix something, I literally would just ask questions to help them direct so that they could figure out what they want the solution to be. In fact, I use it with my kids now too, and I love it. My daughter came to me the other day with a problem, and I immediately am thinking in my head, oh, she could do A, B, or C. And then I was like, nope, stop. Let me ask you some questions. And she ended up coming to the conclusion of what she should do all by herself. And to see the smile on her face and like how excited she was so rewarding for me.
Yeah. And, for us as women, and of course, raising a young female leader for you, that's empowerment. That's a different way of leadership. And we you and I talk a lot about this in our sessions, but there is an older model of leadership development, and there's an older model of what would be considered, power in the workplace that relies on, you come to me, you need me, I give you the answers, you go away and you come back when you need me again. And so that's not just been in the coaching space, it's been in leadership. And so these dysfunctional kind of businesses evolve out of leaders making people rely on them. And that's what causes burnout. That's what causes all kinds of other issues in the workplace. And so what's happening is you're learning a way of leading, not just with your own life and at work and at home, but you're learning how to lead from a place of, I can empower others. And when I empower others, they find their own answers, which means you don't have to go talk your daughter back into doing whatever she decided to do, because she took ownership that she's empowered to say, oh, I figured that out. And when we figure out something, it's far less work to get somebody to follow through on it. You don't have to motivate, and you don't have to give incentives, and you don't have to say, all these things that we come up with in corporate to try to reward people. You don't have to do that anymore, because people walk in and they say, I decided I was going to do this, and now I'm going to do it. And if they couldn't figure out what to do it, they'll come back and ask, but you'll be there to say, let me help you find whatever else you need. And so in that, we, in our sessions and with my clients, know that that's kind of our little social norm. But out in the broader workplace, that's a very different way of leading, don't you think?
100%. Absolutely. And it's the way I used to lead. I mean, an associate would come to me with a problem. I'd say we can do A, B, or C, and we'd talk through what we felt was the best decision and move on.
Yeah.
But yes, you said it. The work that I did with you and it's freed me up. It's helped me to delegate more to my team members, who now feel like they are empowered to make these decisions and can do so without even bringing them to me sometimes.
So what do you think the workplace would look like if more people would shut up and sit down and go within and do the work to find their own truth and wisdom and power, and then bring that out in the world, not to control others, but to empower other people to do the same thing?
Oh, I would think it would be amazing. You'd have a lot of enlightened people who were, awake and aware of other people's feelings and intentions. And I think one of the things you've always told me too is with absent information, people write their own stories. And I have to remind myself sometimes, reading an email or, hearing a conversation secondhand, that I start to create my own story in my head. And I'm like, again, a stop moment. Nope. Go to the source, figure out what's going on. It creates so much less conflict. People just appreciate the honesty and the just having that direct dialogue and contact.
Yeah. And you know what I hear you saying, and we talked about this on the last episode about thoughts. And you've heard me say this a lot too. In mindfulness, the shutting up and sitting down is not to stop the thoughts, right? The thoughts that, you've been doing this for how many years? Do you still have thoughts?
Oh, thousands.
60,000 on average if you're reading the book. So here's the thing. We don't stop the thoughts. But talk a little bit about what your relationship is now with the thinking process, because we're talking in the book and thoughts lead into emotions. But what's your relationship with thoughts now that you've learned how to shut up and sit down and be with them?
Yeah. Like you said, I still have thousands of thoughts, but I've figured out how to let them come in and then go right back out. I also have a practice where I pick a word a day. It's a positive word a day that I really focus on if I am having trouble kind of just focusing on one thought. And it's like it's actually a weekly mantra. I pick one once a week. But it really helps me focus and get rid of the other thoughts or have them move through my mind at a much quicker rate if I feel like I can't focus very well. But it's cleared my mind to be able to say to myself, what am I feeling right now? What emotion is going on inside of me? And just, holding in that space, holding space for that feeling.
Yeah. And the curiosity. And I love what you said. And in each episode, as we're building these, I'm trying to remember. So for our listeners, I've committed that we're going to talk about one mindfulness practice on each episode. We're going to talk about a human story, whether it's mine or my guest story. And then what we're going to do is just have a little bit of content that they could walk away with and actually learn that they can use. So what's really cool about, you just walked us right in. And so you mentioned mantra, and that's another mindfulness practice. And actually the word mantra, you all, in Sanskrit means mind focus. And so there are thousands of ways to shut up and sit. And this would be a perfect one. So when you do your mantra, having that word, that mind focus, what it does is it gives you something where to put your mind's attention. The other thoughts, they still come and go, don't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so what we do with a mantra is we just hold it in our mind quietly. And then when we're holding it there, so do you mind if I ask what's your mantra for this week?
No, it's spontaneity.
Ooh, spontaneity. I love that. Mm-hmm. The little Pippi Longstocking in you, which is her alter ego, which that's a whole nother, we've got like 5 episodes now that we're just going to keep you coming back. And so spontaneity. So when you're in your shut up and sit practice, you're going within and you're holding that word in your mind's eye, spontaneity. What happens when the other thoughts come? What do you do?
I basically let them come in and then go right back out.
Yeah. And then do you put your attention back on, spontaneity? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's that simple. Like it's really, that's why I love this language. And I know some people in the corporate world were like, Yedda, are you sure you want to say words like shut up and sit? Because I want to drop below all the dogma. this isn't about, and you know this because we've done this work, integrating mindfulness, science, psychology, corporate, business, behavior, finance, like it's all in our conversations. But as we started this work with you, we taught you, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And then what am I doing as a result? And so in typical leadership development, it's, well, just stop doing that and do this. But the truth is, if you've got an old patterned behavior in your unconscious that you don't even see, that's kind of out of sight, out of mind, if we don't bring that up, and that's exactly what you just mentioned, what you learned to do, to go, wait a minute, if I'm feeling stress, which this whole chapter we're going to teach you all about, what are feelings? And now that you know they're coming from thoughts. So thoughts are mental units of energy. And then those mental units of energy go in motion into the body, into the cells. That's what an emotion is the energy of the thought in motion in the physical cells. And so that's why we can quickly tap into feeling. Well, what am I feeling? I'm feeling stressed out. Why? And the process right there to stop and go within and say, wait a minute, let me get quiet and ask, why am I feeling this way? And so for you, learning that process, it sounds like, and having known you, has given you a little freedom and space, like you said, and liberation to say, let me do some inquiry. And that's the part, if we do that first, then we can show up and do a different action that then creates a feeling that naturally produces a byproduct of a thought. So it's kind of like you pulled up your belief systems, looked at the ones that were kind of holding you back as a leader, and then learned through your shutting up and sitting down practices, which are a myriad. You just mentioned one of them. I know you have lots. But through that process, then you could say, oh, now here's how I'm going to show up as a result of the pause or the pattern interruption. So your mantra, spontaneity, is a word. And so you just come back to the attention of paying attention to spontaneity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, when you do these weekly mantras, do you start to see the words show up in the outside world in a certain form?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think take, for example, spontaneity. It's a word. There are, I think, about 52 cards in this that I pull from. And it comes up before, and I remember one week my daughter asked me if she could spend the night out, and it was a school night, but the next day it was like a half day, and they were watching a movie or something like that. And I was like, no, the rules in our house are that you don't spend the night on a school night. And then I remembered spontaneity popped into my head, and I was like, you know what? No, you can go. And it was like Christmas for her, right? It's stuff like that where I think it pops in, and I'm like, how can I use this in my like everyday life and practice?
Yeah, I love that. And you know what you're reminding me is, and gosh, now I can't remember the name of it. You might know it, or our listeners might. On Netflix recently, I saw this movie, and was it Tina Fey? Who was in it? And she's a mom, and it's like Yes Day or something, where like for one day, whatever the parents want or whatever the kids want, the parents have to say yes to. And I thought that would be hysterical to watch, because basically it, like, you know, how Hollywood goes. By the time the movie's over, the whole family is, you know, done all kinds of cool personal growth and development and, and coming back together, because the kids get them to do all this crazy stuff because they got out of a pattern. And the truth is, and you know this from this work, you were just in some patterns. Mm-hmm. And I say this a lot in my language, you know, that autopilot. I get up, I go to work, I do this happens, that happens, I do that, I go home. Do you spend a lot of your time on autopilot now?
No, and it's funny that you use that word, because I think I used that with you too, where I did feel like I was on autopilot. It was where I literally was just going through the motions. I wasn't fully present, like I was physically there and I was having conversations and responding, but my mind felt like it was thinking about things I needed to do the following week, or where I needed to take the kids that week, what responsibilities were coming up and things that needed to be addressed, because those thoughts were constantly in my head. And so I felt like I was on autopilot. And now it's kind of hard to describe, but it is. You feel like you're just so much more present and involved. And I actually am like hearing and listening and understanding and seeing emotion and picking up on things that I wouldn't have picked up on when I'm having conversations with people now because of that.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of our recent conversation. So, you know, for our listeners, Karrie and I get together, you know, on a regular basis with our sessions, but once a year with the CEO, who again is not watching the show. And we have a conversation with him just to kind of check in, to be like, hey, you know, how are things going? Just to see what he sees and what he's aware of in your own personal development. And you've got some pretty big aspirations as a leader in the future, not only in the company that you're in, but in this industry. And so I'm curious, how helpful is that for you to hear your CEO's feedback in what he's seen in your own leadership development and personal growth journey?
Oh, it's super helpful. I mean, it just reaffirms that the work that I'm doing is important, and it's making an impression on people, and it's, helping me be more successful in my role.
Yeah.
And as a leader.
Yeah. So as a leader, but also as a woman, and I'm curious about this. I mean, we are the minority, and you and I have a lot of conversations about this. I'm not here to go wearing my suffrage ribbon and beating on my chest and forcing men to shut up and sit down. That's not it. That's not what shut up and sit means, people. So don't take that from this episode. I'm a firm believer that if we all do this work to shut up and sit down and go within, which the last episode talking about that climbing the ladder of inference, which you're very familiar with, if we can figure out what we believe and how we see the data in the world and how we climb and make assumptions and draw conclusions and take actions, what happens is we can then also learn everybody else is doing that as well. And so from the female leadership point of view, we've talked a lot about what's it like to be a woman in the corporate world, what's female leadership like, what are the challenges we're facing. But we also talk about some very different ways to show up and be able to sit with what is. And instead of trying to attack people and force them to change what they believe about women in leadership, unconscious bias, all these big words that are floating around right now with diversity and inclusion, I'm curious what you think could happen for minorities, and we're going to speak about from the women's point of view because we're both women here today. What would happen if people started to do the work to shut up and sit and go within and start to invite female leaders to the table more and to have more of a presence? Where do you see this going? Because I know that you're very involved in the community here around female leadership and empowerment. So what's your thoughts about that?
I just think it would open up the conversation for more input and more diversity of thought. It would, I think we'd make better decisions. I think if we could get people to listen and, like you said, be aware that there are different values and beliefs out there, and not come in to change somebody's mind. I love to, Brene Brown is one of my favorite authors.
Me too.
And she always says that she's, here to get it right, not to be right. And I think a lot of times people come into a meeting or a situation to be right and not just to get it right. And I think if they're much more aware of different feelings, of where people are coming from, there's less conflict in those conversations.
Yeah, and I love what you said, and it's one of my, what some of my clients call the Yedda isms, but it's, I say we're human beings, we're not human doings. So it's not all, it is, it's about, it's about being able to be with other people and to really hear what they're saying, what they're not saying. Part of our narrative coaching in our sessions is, and I've taught you this, don't just listen for what people are saying. And this is important for you all listening. Listen for what people aren't saying. That's just as important, because we're so quick and our brains work so fast because we're just addicted to wanting to know information that we're already moving 10 steps ahead of ourselves. Like you said, I'm all of a sudden I'm in a meeting and I'm blasting through this information while I'm thinking of 10 other things. Now, that doesn't mean that stops, but it means our sitting practice and this idea of mindfulness, whichever one you choose, begins to cultivate a simple process of you being able to show up and pay attention on purpose without judgment. I think that's the key piece in what you're talking about with Brene Brown. Look, we're not always going to be right, and we may not even always do the right things, but if we can just show up as our whole united self, kind of this, you'll appreciate this. I was looking this weekend. This is a total side note, but it came to me. Tiffany's current ad campaign is Strength in a United Self. And I'm like, oh, I'm so going to steal that line because, I love my Tiffany's. But, and I love Tiffany's because it's nice things, but I love it because it's just such a metaphor when we do this work. You're going within, typically in personal development, actually, I take that back. You're going out there to find the most important, most valuable thing to become something better. And the truth is what we do with this work and what you found is you've learned how to go within and find that immortal diamond, that unchanging, most luxurious, divine purchase you could ever find. And it's so funny because it's inside of all of us. I love my shopping, and I know you do too, but so back to this whole thing about this work. And so it's fine to go out there and live life and have fun, but we don't always get it right. And so this idea that when we show up, and especially as women, because we're multitasking, we're always on the go, we have a lot of other things that we're typically caregivers. So that's a typical. I want to make sure I know there are outliers. People would say that's not true. Some guys stay at home, and I'm just saying typically women as a social norm, we've been raised to be caregivers. We have a lot of other expectations. How does that play out in your leadership with your home life? You have your husband, you have 2 kids, you have a dog. You manage yourself as a leader. You manage your team, you manage an entire personal life as well. So what do you think women are up against and facing in the leadership development area, knowing that that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tough, and especially now that we're in this pandemic and schools are closed and kids are at home, learning from home. And so you've got, senior female leaders out there that are also acting as parents, they're acting as teachers. That's why you're seeing them fall out of the workforce. Unfortunately, we're taking a bunch of steps back in some progress that was made of women in leadership roles. But I do think that being able to have kind of a mindfulness practice helps you keep all of that in check. It helps you manage the stress and manage the anxiety. It helps you really ground yourself. But I'm a big proponent of self-love and self-care too. And you got to remember that it starts with you. And so if you're not well, if you can't take care of yourself, if you can't, both physically and mentally, you can't care for your family or be a productive member in a leadership role at an organization either. So you really have to make sure that you're carving out time for yourself in order to be able to manage that stress in your life, because it is hard. It's possible. I always say there's no such thing as work-life balance. It's kind of a pendulum. It swings back and forth between the two. Sometimes I'm much more of a COO and leader than I am a mom, and then sometimes it flip-flops. And being a mom comes first and being a COO comes second. So you just have to have, that flexibility, the adaptability, dealing with change. I mean, all of that.
Yeah. And, you're reminding me as you're talking that a friend of mine from high school saw one of the posts that I put up about the Shut Up and Sit podcast. And she was like, girl, my version of Shut Up and Sit is just hanging out with my bestie on the back porch with a glass of wine. That's about all I can do. And you know what my response to her was? It's funny because 10 years ago, it would have been like, well, you know what? That's not healthy. And now I replied and I was like, you know what? Me and my bestie do the same thing. And sometimes you just got to shut up and sit down with a glass of wine with a good girlfriend. Mm-hmm. And that is a practice in and of itself in the beginning. Now, I want to bring this up. You still do, and I know I do. We still do fun, normal things. I admit, and my mom's not here, but I admit that I still like to have a glass of wine or two. And I like to go to a nice restaurant. You know my story. I like to hold a nice crystal glass in my hand, be surrounded by beautiful things. But I do that mindfully. And I'm curious, what things in life do you want our listeners to hear? I certainly don't want them to get the message that we're asking them to give up all their belongings and go down into the ashram path. Because if you know me and you know Karrie, we don't live that life. But what would you say to people out there? Is it possible to live in the both-handedness, be in both of these worlds, be on the inside silent and still and mindful, and then still get up and go out and be a part of the world? Like, what's that like? What's the message you'd want to give women out there? Like, yeah, can you do this? And what's that like?
Absolutely. You've always equated mindfulness to me as diet and exercise. And, I do think that's an important part of being healthy. I myself am a huge runner. You talked about having a glass of wine out on the patio with your girlfriend. I've got 2 girlfriends that I run with 3 days a week, and they are like my support system, my rock. They are both working mothers as well. So they're kind of my like mini therapy session as well too sometimes on certain days. But just having kind of that routine of like, okay, I've got, when are you going to be fitting your exercise into the day? When are you going to fit the mindfulness into the day? And even if it's just like the other day, instead of sitting and listening to something or sitting in silence, I went out and sat on my front porch. I had lunch, put my plate down, and I sat there in the sun for 10 minutes with my eyes closed and just sat. And I remember my husband came out of the house and he was like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm sitting in silence. And it's lovely.
Yeah. And that is unusual for people because we're so afraid of the silence and the stillness. And so what I'm hearing you say is you've actually really, and this was my tagline I took from Tiffany's ad too, was you've actually learned to become the love of your own life. Like, I love this idea of like to learn to say I do to you. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think shutting up and sitting down is all about. And guys, I know if you're listening, you don't have to be in the Tiffany's mindset, and you can still say I do to you too. And that all applies to both genders. But, for me, I thought, wouldn't that be cool if we raised a world and we had leaders and and up and coming leaders, our own kids, coming out into the world and understanding the most sacred and beautiful and important relationship is with yourself. And if you know yourself and you can shut up and sit down and go within, and then we begin to raise people and teach these, this is the thought, and this is what a feeling is, and this is what your behavior is, so that we kind of break it down so people understand everybody's doing it. It's kind of like, and I'm going to really, my mom's definitely going to go off the rails when I say this. It's kind of like my ex-mother-in-law looked at me once when I first got married, and she goes, every generation thinks they're the one that invented sex. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't. I was like 20.
How do you respond to that?
I looked at her with big eyes and was like, oh my God. And it was so freeing though. And I love her dearly still to this day. And what I loved about her honesty was, there are some things we don't have to talk about openly all the time, but I want you to know that I know, that you know, that we know, we all know about it. And I feel like mindfulness and this kind of inner journey is the same thing. Is everybody has the potential to do it. That's why I love the language, shut up and sit. I don't want this to be, somebody messaged me the other day and was like, I heard about your shut up and sit. Are you a Buddhist practitioner? And instead of saying no, I asked him a question and I said, well, that's so interesting. I'm curious. Why do you ask? And he goes, well, I'm resonating with a lot of what you say. And my response was, I like to say, I just shut up and sit. That's it. I sit in silence. I sit in stillness. Because for me, I don't care if you're Christian, if you're Buddhist, if you're Muslim, Hindu, whatever your religion is, silence and stillness drop below all of that. And I think, and I also believe in the corporate world, we have to start to begin to just creep a little bit into the conversation of people going within to do the work. And I think religion has kind of stopped that in this typical traditional meditation language or world. Companies are open to it. Don't get me wrong. I've written articles about it recently. But when this becomes a mainstream thing, and I think about your company, what's the value of inviting people into silence like you did on the front porch versus inviting them into some type of structured, you've got to do it this way and it's got to look like this, and then there's all these religious aspects to it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Because meditation or mindfulness looks different for everybody. Everybody's practice is going to look different. Could it be a structured class or a session at the mindfulness bar? 100%. Could it be sitting on the
for the plug.
Yeah, you're welcome. You like how I fit that in there?
You did. You rocked it.
It could be sitting on the front porch, with the sun shining on your face. It could be listening to a guided imagery. It could take all shapes and forms. It could, as I mentioned, it's sitting in yoga class during Shavasana, and that's like where you get your 5 minutes of mindfulness every day. It's different for everybody, but I'd say embrace what works for you and don't be afraid of it. I think people, you've said this before, and you said it when you came over and kind of talked to our firm, which is, it's not this like Buddha thing. You don't have to make it religious. You don't have to make it this, Zen thing we're all sitting around singing Kumbaya and holding hands. It's just whatever works for you and helps settle your mind.
Yeah. And that is absolutely what I want you as the listener to take away from this today, that, we've talked about mantra. We've talked about a lot of ways that Karrie has implemented this. Using this in a coaching practice, years ago would have been totally out of the question. Those two worlds didn't even collide. But what we're really talking about when we shut up and sit is the invitation to go within, to sit with and figure out who you are, what you really want, and how to bring that united self, the ego and the soul and all the parts of you. And, when you started the talk today, you talked about what life was like growing up at home and having, several adopted siblings and over 40 kids coming and going. Those behaviors, those patterns that were created in you, some of them could have been wounds. And for most of us at some point in our life, we had wounding, but a lot of it was wisdom. And a lot of it was for you to take out into the world. And some, as leaders, I want you guys to hear this, as we begin to go into leadership development, some inquiry to go within to say, what do I think, feel, and behave? How is that showing up in the world? So when we go into this work, it gives us the freedom to kind of go all the way back to the core of what's going on and say, hey, there might be parts of myself, and we did that a little bit in the beginning, but what parts of myself kind of have splintered off, or has my ego started to do to really protect and control things? And can I invite her back into the conversation and say, hey, you have value, you matter. Because when you start to sit down and you start to get in real relationship with yourself, you start to realize there's some really cool stuff in there. And so as we begin to close the episode and we start talking about ego, I love to talk about the ego. And now I'm such best friends. When my ego starts going and that narrative, that constant chatter starts kicking in, I'm like, girl, what are you trying to tell me today? Like, what attention do you need? So as we begin to wrap up, when you hear your own ego, what does she sound like and how do you talk to her?
She sounds like Tina Fey, actually. It's funny that you mentioned that earlier on the podcast.
I did not lead you into that.
No, you didn't, but she is. I mean, she is like that's who she talks to me. And she's funny, but she's practical. We have a lot of similarities. People, if anybody that I work with is listening to this, they did a parody one time of how similar Tina Fey and I are, which I think is really funny. And then
that's awesome.
I stayed at this hotel in Charlottesville one time, and they had key passes for the hotel. It's the Graduate. I don't know if you know that chain of hotels. My key pass they gave me was Tina Fey.
Oh, I love it.
See, it's meant to be.
That's awesome. So when Tina Fey shows up, how do you talk to her in your head? Like, what do you do? And because she's got a lot of energy. So what do you do? I'm not sure. I just have conversations with her. I mean, just again, what is this feeling? What do you want today? What is it that that you're thinking? What's bothering you? How are you going to handle it? So just a dialogue. And so what's cool? So kind of in this where we're headed in the next couple of episodes coming up about emotion, and I think Tina Fey is a perfect one. So if your ego is out there running the show and you believe the ego is who you are. So if Tina Fey was out there, most of the times our ego is just running on sheer emotion. It's not running on a lot of factual information. Its whole job is to go out there and protect us, right? And so it's got these feelings and it's got just a lot of energy behind it. So what I love about this work and what we did with you and what I learned to do and what I do with a lot of my clients is bringing that energy. So when we shut up and sit down, Tina doesn't go away. I think that's a really important thing to point out. Tina doesn't go away. And so where I'm going, and you don't know this yet, I haven't told you, but I have a whole other book idea of love letters to the ego. So if you've got to fall in love with your ego and invite your ego, so you're hanging out with Tina Fey 24/7, but what would it look like? It's such a cool question to get your ego on board with you to go even deeper into this work. So could you imagine if you had Tina Fey? I can see a whole movie of Tina Fey shutting up and sitting down and going within and telling us her whole internal landscape. So as you guys are listening and we start to close today, the whole point of this episode was just to talk about emotions, help you understand where they come from. They come from our thoughts. It's not always linear. People sometimes go, well, can emotions come first? Technically, thoughts create emotions. Emotions drive behavior. But it is also cyclical. So wherever you are in this game and you want to jump in and start looking at your emotions, or you want to start with thoughts, or you want to start with behavior, you're welcome to jump into this process and be a part of it. The conversation is just to get you to understand if you go within, you can find silence and stillness. And Karrie has been such a great testament to this, not only as a client, but on the show today, that whatever it is you want to create in your life, you are creating it. You can create it. And so any last words of wisdom for our female leaders listening for the direction of where you're headed with your own leadership in life that you think you could leave with the listeners before we wrap up?
I would say that if you've ever been contemplating, getting an executive coach or a leadership coach or doing some of this work, do it. It's worth every penny.
Yeah. I say that wholeheartedly. And here's what's really cool about this work. You might do that with a lot of different people. Not one person on the planet has the answers. And so, Karrie's lucky enough, and I might only have a couple of spots open right now in my own coaching, but we can't all serve everybody. So if you're out there and you're looking and you want to find somebody, I'm happy to put you in contact with folks. There's some great folks all over the globe that I work with. And I don't know if you knew this, Karrie, but I started teaching Monday night with Dory Clark and Alyssa Cohn. I don't know if you know them in the female leadership world. They're kind of big up there in Forbes. They're known as like the startup coaches, #1 best-selling authors. So we're teaching, and I'm helping them on this platform with female coaches and helping them to grow their business on a much broader level so we can empower more women. Doesn't mean I don't work with men, and I know lots of women and female coaches that do work with men, but there's a real big movement right now, and women are just naturally drawn into the coaching field. We're we're out there. But what I think is really cool is as this field is growing, we're all holding each other's hands and helping lift one another up in the female leadership industry. So I just want to encourage you guys, if you want to ask a question, you guys can find me on LinkedIn. You can find Karrie. You can drop us a note. We'd be happy to answer any questions for you around that female leadership space and where you're headed with that, connect you with whomever. But it's been such an honor and a pleasure to hang out with you, to shut up, to sit. When Pete does check with me and says, hey, I was looking for where Karrie was the other day, I'm just going to be like, MIA, go silent. I'm not even going to practice my wisdom practice. I'm just going to shut up and sit and just be like, I don't know, Pete. I don't know where she was. So anyway, all right, coming up next, Robin's given me the signal. We've run out of time. Oh man, I could keep doing this for a while. So we're going to actually move into a little bit about the emotional guidance scale coming up next. I'm going to have my mom come back, because I know you know this, Karrie. In the book, there's this really cool visual of the emotional guidance scale. We're going to be talking about what that is, how do you use it. And so my mom literally had this image designed, and when it went on the internet the first time, it was like the number one thing searched by Google. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. I didn't know your mom designed that.
Yeah, she did. And who knew? So, it's even got a little credential for her in here. So it's built off of some of the law of attraction, some really cool research on emotions. But so mom's coming back, and we're going to talk about that. We've got some really cool stuff ahead after that. And so as always, Karrie, thanks so much for coming to hang out, doing a little day drinking of some silence down here at the Mindfulness Bar, sharing your words of wisdom. And until next time, you guys, you know where to go. If you want the book, the workbook, anything else, shutupandsit.com. And I'll see you on the next episode, and have a great day. Thanks again, Karrie.
Thanks, Yedda.
All right.
May you know goodness. May you know peace. May you know contentment. May you be